this week they're doing the STAR testing. So a lot of your instructors have probably told you that it's asynchronous, that they're going to be testing. I'm not testing, so we're going to continue with the schedule as it is on the calendar. So we have class this week today and also Thursday and on Friday. There is no discussion due this week, but we will start talking about essay number 2 on Friday. That's due, I think, the first week of May. So it's about a month that you have to work on that paper. And I'll talk about it. You can look at it here if you want to ahead of time, but I'll talk about it specifically on Friday. And then Thursday, we're going to read an essay. It's not a poem, it's an essay. So it's a little bit different in terms of, your mindset when you're reading, by Mary Wollstonecraft, called Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So that one, we're just reading the introduction to it. It's pretty short, but I do want you to read her bio. And there's a little study guide that could help you if you're struggling with that. I do think vocabulary is important in that text. So as you're preparing for Thursday, do make sure that you look up words that you don't know. Mary Wollstonecraft was definitely an intellectual, and so she uses, we're going to get interrupted a little bit because they're doing testing logistics. But yeah, so do make sure that you, even though it's only a few pages, give yourself a decent amount of time on that piece, because it's a really important turning point in the suffrage movement, in women's rights. And she makes some really, really good points that are probably still valid today in some places in the world. So anyway, what other announcements did I have? I wrote some things down. I already talked about the STAR test. Oh, open house. Open house is on Wednesday. And the way it's going to work is virtual. So your parents can come in. I keep interrupting with announcements. I don't know if you can hear that or not. It's distracting. There's a little schedule. This isn't posting yet on your Google Classroom. It will post Wednesday afternoon. But every one of your teachers, your East teachers, should have in the classwork section of their Google Classroom something about open house. And it's going to be going from 5:30 till 7:30 on Wednesday. There's a little schedule. So your parents are supposed to hop in and out of the Zoom meetings. And this is where the teachers are posting the Zoom link. So every teacher has a different Zoom. And we're just going to kind of, for those 2 hours, go through, I think it's like 15 minutes for each class period. So if your parents want to participate in that, this will pop up on I don't want to confuse everybody. So it's going to pop up Wednesday afternoon, and the open house is Wednesday evening. So there's this schedule that they put out. People are coming in. And it's about 15 minutes in each one of the class periods. Now, obviously, if you have an STC instructor that is not an East teacher, then that period, they're not going to be meeting for the open house. But those East teachers that you have should be holding open house. 15 minutes is not a lot of time to talk or, go over things. It's not an individual thing. So we're not meeting with the parents individually, but we can certainly set up conferences with them. So if your parents want to participate in that on Wednesday, then where they can find all of the links, this is the schedule, the links are on each teacher's Google Classroom classwork page. So you can see right here is the link for my Zoom. So your parents will literally jump in and out of how many ever classes you have if they want to participate in that. So that's an opportunity that's coming up on Wednesday. Also, I've graded paper number 1. All those grades and comments are present in Blackboard. So you can go back and look at those. I think the papers were in pretty good shape for the most part. If there were issues, then I made a note about it. There is another paper that is coming up in, we're gonna talk about it on Friday. I'll introduce the research paper to you, and then that one is due the first week of May or sooner. You know, look at your deadlines and see what works for you in terms of turning it in. I'll probably make the paper available for submission on Blackboard when we go online with the next unit, which is on Friday. We're going to start the Victorians on Friday. So right about the time that I'm talking about paper number 2, you know, I'll make the submission live so that whenever you're ready with that paper, you can turn it in. You do not have to wait until the due date if you have crunch time or lots of other things going on in your classes at that time, but we'll go over paper number 2. I'm finishing up discussions 5 and 6, so those grades should be going in this week. We do not have a discussion this week, so it's a good week for me to catch up on those 2. You should have finished up with discussion 6 yesterday. That one was about Gulliver's Travels, and the next one that we have is next week for number 7. So throughout this week, the 6 weeks ends on the 16th. So over this, you know, next few days, I'll be putting in those last 2 grades, which are the 5th and 6th discussions. Also, there was an assignment that I did that was just for the East grade book on Thursday. Kind of wanted to give people some experience looking at the Romantic period poetry. So there's, you know, those of you who were here in class did it in class, and those grades are already in. But for people who weren't in class on Thursday, there was kind of a quick assignment that gave you the opportunity to look at the qualities of Romantic poetry in the poems that we had read for that day. So there's, we did the assignment in class, but there's an opportunity here, and it describes how you can make that up if you weren't in class on Thursday. But I do think that you should do that sooner rather than later. I'm going to look at those, grade them, and they will be included here in the 5th, 6th weeks. So for the East grade book, I think that if you can find, you know, one example of the qualities of Romantic poetry, then I think you'll be in good shape for the final and also for that assignment. So it should be a pretty easy grade of that if you need to make that up. What else was I going to talk about in terms of announcements? If you've just joined us, I did make a PDF of today's selections. We're reading 3 different poets, and I selected just certain poems of theirs so that we could kind of streamline our discussion for today, or the notes. So if you would like to have the same PDF that I created, it's only 19 pages. I was telling the group before class started that it gets a little much to be scrolling through that 3,000 page PDF, at least for me it does. So I'm going to be using this document here, which you can find in the reading section of this unit. You can also find it on the calendar. I linked it right here. And if you want to make your own annotations, I use Kami. It's free, kami.com. I think you can log in with your Google account and use it. It's just super handy. So I just took it down to the stuff that we're discussing for today and created this document. It's 19 pages instead of 3,000 pages. So if you want your own copy of that, you can certainly click on that, put it in your Google Drive, and then when you go to open it from your Google Drive, I don't know if you've used Kami before, but anytime you're opening a PDF, I'll try to open it here and I'll show you. At the top up here, it will say open with, and if you have an account with Kami and you've connected it to your account, then you can just automatically open it, and then you can annotate there if that is handy for you. But today I want to talk about the big 3 of Romantic poets. Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Those are the main sort of staple Romantic poets. You can see in the background that I've chosen a romantic image as we talk about capital romantic, the idea of isolation, right? the idea of nature as a character. It's larger than, it's taking over the painting here. And also I included these clouds. I like this image because it includes the idea of the brooding hero, right? The romantics are all about the ideal, but you and I know that life isn't ideal. So how do you handle that if your art and your mind are always looking for the ideal, but life is giving you less than that? And so that's one of the features that we're going to talk about, especially with these three poets who really embody the concept of the romantic poet. So the first one we're going to talk about today is Byron. Byron, we just call him Byron, but his real name is George Gordon. I'll just tell you a quick story. I don't know if it's here in the background or not. You should have read the background. I can't remember if it's in there or not. But Byron, we just call him Byron. But he was a kid in boarding school. I think he was 11 or 12 years old, George Gordon, when they came to tell him that his uncle had died and he was the new Lord Byron. And he got an estate and all kinds of money and a title and all kinds of stuff. And so Byron was a bit of he was pretty arrogant. I took a class on Byron where it was all Byron all the time. So Byron is not my favorite. Not because of the class, but just because the more I read of him, he's not my favorite of the three. Let's put it that way. Keats is probably my favorite of the three, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't study him because he's a big name. He traveled a lot. He had a lot of lovers and left a lot of women in tears, and men too. And so he became Lord Byron. So his full title is George Gordon Lord Byron, but his real name is George Gordon. And the poem that I asked you to read two poems by Byron. This is all the background. So if you have the PDF, then you can scroll to these pages and put in notes if you like. I didn't assign this one. I often do, but this time I think I took it out when I was reconfiguring the course. But there is a concept called the Byronic hero. And you can label it with this poem if you want to, or just kind of make a note about it. So the Byronic hero, Byron wrote a lot of really, really long works of poetry, poems that were 40, 50, 90, 150 pages. And they're not narrative. They're sort of generally narrative, but there's a lot of philosophical, sort of romantic musing and isolation and fretting about my place in the world in them. So the Byronic hero is a term that we use a lot to reference the characterization of the thinking person during this time. The Byronic hero is envisioned by Byron in a number of his works, but is basically a suffering artist. So if we have, that mental idea about the artist that is tormented and, is addicted and, fails at their art and has failed romances and, just has this suffering lifestyle, we usually think of that as the Byronic hero. Because I already mentioned that romantics have this idealized view of life, which we've already noticed in romantic poetry. Problem is, life is not ideal. So you could keep writing like life is ideal, but how do you reconcile that with reality? So the Byronic hero is just a term that you might want to know, and you can get the spelling of it right there. This is a really cool poem. You can go back and read it if you want to, but it taps into some lesser known myths. I mean, ancient myths, Hero and Leander. Okay, so one of the first ones that I asked you to read for today was She Walks in Beauty, which is a classic poem of ideal beauty. This is probably Byron's most famous poem, short poem anyway. And it goes like this. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So the she in this poem is sort of like the ideal beauty, right? I highlighted elements of this person, um, this woman, everything that is good and bad, light and dark is perfect within her. There's a balance that she strikes. You can see that in these lines, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. So she's beautiful the way the night is beautiful. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress. Her hair is the perfect color of black, and that's why she's compared to the night, right? One tiny little hue more or less would have been imperfect, but her hair is just the perfect raven or black hair. So it just over and over again, she's the perfect classic beauty. And we can see also the quality of overflow of emotion in this poem, the exclamation point at the end. Not only is she beautiful, but her mind is at peace and her heart is innocent. So she's like the complete package. Most of it's about her beauty, though. That's the thing with the romantics. It's most of the time about the outward appearance of something and what nature has done to her beauty. So, but she does have a heart whose love is innocent and a mind that's at peace. Um, Another poem that I asked you to read, you can stop me if you want me to talk about any of these poems a little bit more. Hopefully, when you read them, you kind of got the basic idea for what they were about and tried to look at the qualities of romantic poetry, right? These ones that we have over here that we practiced with on Thursday last week. So I'll be pointing out where some of these are in these poems. We're always going back to these. Stanzas for music. So this one is another one about human beauty. And in this, we can really see nature as a character. Nature is a character in She Walks in Beauty, but there are different elements of nature that pop up in this poem as um, sort of characters because they are revering this person's beauty. So if nature is bowing to you, then you must be the greatest product of nature, more than the ocean and the wind and summer and the moon. So you can kind of see that romantics lay it on kind of thick. They kind of overwhelm you with, ideal talk. And like kind of like the way that we saw in the shepherd poem, right? um, come and live with me and be my love. That one. We'll just live in the country. Nothing about hard work, nothing about getting up early, nothing about feeding animals, nothing about any of that. We'll have silver buckles and, the ideal. So stanzas for music goes like this. There be none of beauty's daughters with a magic like thee. So nothing of beauty, and beauty is personified here because beauty has daughters. Nothing is as beautiful as you, and like music on the waters is thy sweet voice to me. When as if sound were causing the charmed oceans pausing, the waves lie still and gleaming, and the lulled winds seem dreaming. So it's a perfect setting, and you're even more beautiful than that perfect setting. And the midnight moon is weaving her bright chain o'er the deep, whose breast is gently heaving. The deep is the ocean, right? As an infant sleep, the beautiful ocean as it's kind of like, you can imagine that the waves are like breaths, right? The way that they undulate as an infant sleep. So who sleeps most perfectly? Babies, because that's all they have to do. They don't have any problems, right? They're not up late at night because of their homework. So babies sleeping are, sort of the most tender, perfect form of sleep. So the spirit bows before thee to listen and adore thee with a full but soft emotion like the swell of summer's ocean. So here you have a little different rhyme scheme, but basically nature is bowing to your greatness. Stanzas for music probably refers to the fact that of the way that it rhymes and the cadence of it, you could put this to music. That's true in a lot of romantic pieces, just like Auld Lang Syne. There's a song for that. We talked about that last week. All right, so then we move on to Shelley. Percy Shelley was, Percy is not a name that we see a lot anymore. So just keep in mind that Percy was a man. And they talk a little bit about his background and so on. He had a very educated background, and there's some details about him. He married Mary Shelley, who was the author of Frankenstein. So, you know, you can imagine that they had an intellectual household, one filled with literature and so on. I don't know, did you guys read Frankenstein when you were sophomores? I think Mr. Flores teaches it. Or used to. I don't know. You can let me know in the comments if you remember. All right, so Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. This one's a little bit longer, but I did want to point out a few. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I did want to point out some of the qualities of this poem that stick out as romantic, from the Romantic period specifically. A lot of the similes in this poem are about nature. In this poem, intellectual beauty does not mean necessarily knowledge. It's more like the untangible. I think there's a note about it at the bottom right down here. Non-material, they call it. And in other words, beyond those things that you can see. So there's this concept in the Romantic period called the sublime. And you should write that down. The sublime. I think I noted it on the next poem. Oh no, here it is. I noted it here on page 14 of the PDF. So the sublime, nowadays people just say, oh, that's sublime, meaning that it's nice or it's beautiful or it's awesome. But the sublime has a quality to it for the romantics that makes it a little bit fearful. So something that's sublime is something that's like so beautiful that it hurts, or so perfect that it is scary a little bit. So, you know, you can climb up this mountain and it's gorgeous and beautiful, but it's also frightening to be up that high. It's also frightening that you could injure yourself on that climb. So, you know, it's kind of like beauty is the, you know, the doe that is drinking at the pond in an idyllic forest. The sublime is the tiger, right, who is lapping up at the river, but he's beautiful but more frightening because of his nature. He could turn on you and kill you. The deer probably won't. So there's sort of like this quality to the sublime that makes it more beautiful, but also more fearful and slightly dangerous, if that makes sense. And so a lot of times we see the Romantic poets tap into that idea of the sublime, and we can see it here in this poem, because this poem, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, in this poem, physical beauty is lost. You get that in the first stanza right here. The awful shadow of some unseen power floats through unseen among us, visiting this various world with as inconstant wing as summer winds that creep from flower to flower, like moonbeams that behind some piney mountain shower. It visits with inconstant glance each human heart and countenance, like hues and harmonies of evening, like clouds in starlight widely spread, like memory of music fled, like aught that for its grace may be dear, and yet dearer for its mystery. So that's part of the sublime, right? Hopefully you can see the sublime in that mystery of it, right? Um, that makes it a little bit frightening too if you're not quite sure of its origins or what it might do. And so there's a lot of similes in here that compare this power, which is sort of a general power of nature, probably, to these different elements in nature. Here we have nature as a character in this stanza, spirit of beauty that does consecrate with thine own hues. He's talking to the spirit of beauty. In this poem, the spirit of beauty leaves him and he has to look for it and he questions it. There's even a flashback on stanza 5, and that gives us the idea that it's a first person piece, which is one of the qualities that we see in romantic poetry. So I vowed that I would dedicate my powers to thee and thine, have I not kept the vow? So he's talking still to this spirit of beauty, and he's asking it to return to him, right? And then you get an example of the sublime here on line 72. Oh, that thou, oh, awful loveliness. Awful loveliness is an oxymoron, right? Awful loveliness, but it's so beautiful that it's terrifying. I don't know if that makes sense, but the romantic poets felt like it made sense. Not everything that's beautiful is sublime, because sublime sort of surpasses beauty. You know, something even more beautiful than beautiful. The last one here by Shelley is Ozymandias. I don't know, I think we might have read this first semester when we were studying sonnets, but sonnets are alive and well in the Romantic period. The next few that we'll look at here are sonnets. Ozymandias is a poem that's about the destructive force of nature, and so that can be an element also of the sublime, because nature is beautiful but also destructive. And this poem discusses the wind and sand that eventually eats away at man's creation. So man can create monuments like this one in the desert that is ancient and is made for this king, Ozymandias. But the wind that we, think is so beautiful as it caresses our cheek can be a destructive force. The ocean that we can see that has beautiful waves and so on is a destructive force on the shore. So it's about how nature can be that is ultimately the winner over humans, because no matter what we build, nature will eventually consume it. It goes like this. There are 3 different speakers in this poem, so it's kind of good to keep them straight. I'm assuming you've already read it. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So humans think that they're the conqueror by putting up their monuments, but eventually time will have its way, and nature is fearsome in its destructive forces over time. So there's also the idea of the alienation, right? It's this statue that's alone in the desert, and all that's left is just little bits and pieces of this statue that used to exist in ancient times. So kind of dark there. Like, remember that your life is fleeting, nature is eternal. All right, the last poet for today in the big 3 romantic poets is John Keats. Probably my favorite. I find his writing a little more pleasant. You can read about his background there. And I think we have 2 sonnets by him. So you can label these sonnets. This one is on first looking into Chapman's Homer. It's good to know what Chapman's Homer is and John Keats' experience with that book. There's a footnote there, so hopefully you read your footnotes when you are reading in the textbook. But Chapman's Homer is a specific translation of Homer. Homer is the Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so the story is that Keats was up late at night with his friend, and his friend had given him this version of the Odyssey or the Iliad, it doesn't really say, that he is treasuring, and they're just really delving into the poetry, which is a very romantic period thing to do. Let's forget food, let's forget, other people, and we're just going to read this poetry and live in it. So I guess that's what you do when you don't have the internet to occupy you, or apps. And so this poem is about his experience the first time he read this particular translation of Homer. It's not that it's the first time that he's read Homer, it's that he's reading this translation, which gives him more poetic qualities. I've traveled through these realms before, but reading this version, and there are references to Apollo and so on, but he likens the experience to being the first explorer who, crested over the mountains, first European explorer who crested over the mountains and saw the Pacific Ocean for the first time. And so it's sort of like a whole new experience, and the honor of that, of being the first one. He says it's kind of like if you've ever read a book for the first time. There's a book that I've never finished because I don't want to stop reading it for the first time. You can read a book again, but it's not the same as the first time that you read it. And so he's like, I felt like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken, or his view in the telescope. And there's just something about that first reading that gives you an excitement for the text. And he's talking about that the first time that he read Chapman's Homer. So there are a lot of footnotes in that. So that's another thing about romantic poets. They're very well read. So you have to look at the footnotes to understand what they're talking about a lot of the time. Lots of times they put in ancient references. The last poem on the list for today is the Keats poem, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. Probably one of my favorite poems of the Romantic period, because I feel like we can all we can't all relate to a lot of the Romantic poetry. I mean, not everybody has a book that they haven't finished because they don't want to leave the experience of reading it for the first time. Not everybody has the experiences that we've seen in these other poems, or the draw to the sublime. But When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be is something that we can all relate to. When I start to fear that I might not live long enough to do all of the things that I want to do. And that's what the poem is about. It's likely that we probably will, right? He's got a lot of ideas in his mind, he says in the poem. This is another first person sonnet. When I have fears that I may cease to be before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. Gleaned is a really good word there. Gleaned means to, after the harvest, to pick up all the tiny little pieces that are left behind after the harvest in order to add it to the harvest. Right, so gleaning is an actual job that people used to do. So after the big harvest, they come through with the threshers or with the plow, etc. Then there would be gleaners who came afterwards, and they would just be picking up the tiny little pieces of wheat or whatever, because that can add up to a greater quantity. So he says, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before my pen has a chance to get every ounce of my thoughts out, I worry that I might cease to be before I can get everything out of my brain. Before high-piled books and carrot tree hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. So he's continuing that metaphor, right? before I can get it out into the books, like I would put grain in a granary. If I'm harvesting a field, I'm going to put all the grain that I get from that harvest into a silo or a granary. And so he's saying the book would be his granary if he can write it down and get it stored away in the book. So that's an extended metaphor there, or conceit. When I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of high romance, here we go, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think till love and fame to nothingness do sink. So it's kind of like the worry that your mission on Earth will be incomplete, and dealing with that, because it probably will be, right? There's always more that we could have done. There's more we could have done for our children, or for humanity, or for our art, or our, contribution to society. So this poem, I'm ending on it today because I feel like it's the most relatable of the romantic sentiments. But you can see that he's brooding, he's mad that he might not get to write everything down, and a little bit prophetic because John Keats died young. He drowned, I think. Yeah, you can see that he was 20, I don't know when his birthday is, but 26. So I'm more than double 26, but you guys are almost 26 in a way compared to me. So I'm hoping that looking at these big three romantic poets, these three will stick in your mind as the classic examples of romantic poets from this period. The ones that we looked at on Thursday are romantic period poets. They're just not, like the big time names like we see in today's poems. Are there any questions on any of these poems? I know I went through them fairly quickly, but I'm trying to meet our time frame today. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. Anything you want me to add? I don't see anything. I'll keep it open in case something occurs to you. On Thursday, make sure that you have read The Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. That is an essay. If you weren't here at the very beginning, then I already mentioned that there's some vocabulary that you'll need to look up. Don't get frustrated. It's a really good piece. It's a foundation piece for the suffrage movement that we'll see, sort of gearing up in the Victorian period coming up. And also it's a well-reasoned argument. So you can kind of use your tools from last year, your rhetoric, you can bring those out of retirement and kind of look at the points that she's making, the arguments that she's making. Do make sure that you look up words you don't know and read footnotes on that one. There is a study guide, so I'll probably stick to that for the most part on Thursday. You can look that over ahead of time. And there is a PDF booklet just for those pages, the background on Mary Wollstonecraft, and also the passage that you need to read. I made a PDF booklet of that too. So you can use that to annotate ahead of time if you like, or to read it so that you don't have to deal with that big long PDF. All right, so we'll meet on Thursday to discuss that one, and then we will begin the Victorian era. I'll give you some intro notes on that on Friday, and we'll also start talking about essay number 2. Any questions about the rest of the week? Or remember that Wednesday is the open house. I should put that on this calendar. Okay, then I will see you on Thursday, and I hope that you have a good day. Bye, everybody.